Listen for words of faith from the book of Genesis. It's worth mentioning that in this passage, Jacob is referred to also by his other name, Israel. Then Jacob took up residence in the place where Isaac had settled, the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Joseph. When Joseph was 17 years old, he used to accompany his siblings, the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob's spouses, as they herded the flocks. Joseph would tattle on the others to Jacob while they tended the animals, always presenting them in a negative light. Now Israel doted on the youth because he was a child of his old age. He loved Joseph more than the others, and Israel gave Joseph a richly ornamented robe. When the brothers saw that Israel loved him best, they were jealous and had nothing but words of contempt for the boy. The brothers had gone to tend the herds at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers are tending to the herds at Shechem. I will send you to them." Joseph replied, "I am ready." Israel told Joseph to see if things were going well and to report back to him. So Joseph set off from the valley of Hebron. When he arrived at Shechem and was wandering in the fields in search for the herds, someone asked, "What are you looking for?" Joseph answered, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're tending sheep?" The person said, "They've moved on. I heard them say they were going to Dothan." So Joseph left that place and caught up with the herd at Dothan. They saw Joseph approaching in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to murder the lad. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Now's our chance. Let's kill Joseph and throw his body in one of these pits. We'll say a wild animal devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of Joseph's dreams." Reuben intervened and saved the boy from their hands, saying, "No bloodshed. Throwing him into a pit in the wilderness is one thing, but let's not lay a hand on him." Reuben's intention was to rescue Joseph and return him to Israel. So when Joseph came upon his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornamented robe he wore, and picked him up and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. As they were eating, they noticed an Ishmaelite caravan coming from Gilead with loads of gum, balm, and resin on its way to Egypt. Judah said to the others, "What is to be gained by murdering Joseph and concealing his death? Why not sell Joseph to these Ishmaelites? He is, after all, our flesh and blood, and in that way his blood will not be on our hands." And the others agreed. Meanwhile, some Midianite traders passed by and pulled Joseph out of the pit. They sold him for 8 ounces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph with them into Egypt. For foundational stories of faith, we give thanks.
Hear words of faith from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus insisted that the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side. Having sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, remaining there alone as night fell. Meanwhile, the boat, already 1,000 yards from shore, was being tossed about in the waves, which had been raised by the fierce winds. At about 3 a.m, Jesus came walking towards them on the lake. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and in their fear they began to cry out. Jesus hastened to reassure them. "Don't worry, it's me. Don't be afraid." Peter spoke up and said, "If it is really you, tell me to come to you across the water." "Come," said Jesus. So Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. He began to sink and cried out, "Save me." Jesus immediately stretched out his hand and caught Peter. "You have so little faith," Jesus said to him. "Why did you doubt?" Once they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat showed great reverence, declaring to Jesus, "You are indeed God's own." For the love of God in Christ Jesus, we give thanks.
It's wonderful to be here with you all this morning. Thank you so much for your warm welcome. The visual presented in the story from this Gospel of Matthew about Jesus walking on the water has captured the attention of our culture. It's become part of the vernacular. So to exclaim that someone is walking on water usually means that they're performing something extraordinary or that they are an extraordinary person. In this story, Jesus comes across like a bit of a magician, someone who can perform magic tricks to astound and dazzle people. I've read this story quite often, as most of you have, and I often think to myself, why did Jesus do this? Why did he walk on water? Isn't it a little bit, showy? Is it a trick? What's the point? I don't know what questions come to your mind when you hear this story again. But this week I tried to discern and hear this story from a fresh perspective, with beginner's eyes, as Buddhists say. And I was reflecting on it throughout the week in preparation for today. So just before this story, Jesus has fed 5,000 people and probably more. This is another miraculous and surprising story. He's gathered quite a crowd due to his teaching, and after this, he dismisses them. He also dismisses the disciples. He goes to the mountaintop and he spends the night in prayer. He's alone. And when he finishes, he gets up, he goes to where the disciples are on a boat on the other side of the lake, and it's windy. And this is where we read that Jesus walks on the water in the midst of the wind and the waves towards the disciples. He appears to the disciples walking towards them, and of course, the disciples understandably are frightened. They think they are seeing a ghost. And Jesus comforts them by saying, "Don't be afraid, it's I." And then the second part of this story, the disciple Peter says that, "If it's you, Jesus, I want to step out with you." And so Jesus surprisingly says, "Come." And Peter begins to walk on the water. But just as Peter gets started, he notices the wind and the waves, and he becomes afraid, and so he begins to sink. Jesus reaches out to him and says, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" Sort of like a child who's still learning how to walk, Jesus, full of compassion, supports Peter in his moment of weakness and puts him back on his feet. So, I love many things about this passage, but one thing I really love and that stood out to me quite strongly this week is that when Peter asks Jesus if he too can walk on the water, Jesus says, yes. And I mean, that's not really something that we might expect, because one interpretation of this passage is that the reason that Jesus walked on the water is to prove that he indeed was the Son of God, without doubt. And that might be true. But if you're trying to display your uniqueness, why would you invite others to do what you are only capable of doing? And so as I read this passage again this week and I reflected on it, what came to mind is not so much that Jesus walked on the water to prove his uniqueness, but that Jesus walked on the water to invite others to do what he was doing. What if this passage is about Jesus' invitation to us to participate in his miraculous work? What if the whole reason that Jesus did this magician's trick was to invite others to join with his identity and with his work. This wonderful and enchanting story tells us that Jesus is inviting us to participate with the work that he's doing. So what is the work that God is doing in this church and in our world? The work that God calls us to participate in. We need eyes to see what God is up to in our midst. And sometimes that's not easy to discern. Like the disciples who saw Jesus walking on the water and mistook him for a ghost. Sometimes we also can find it hard to see the surprising work of God right under our noses. Do we have eyes to see the work that God is doing in us, through us, and among us? Sometimes God's work can look miraculous. Other times it's hidden in the most ordinary things. In this story, Jesus is presented as the one who has the attention of the wind and the waves. So creation listens to and participates with Jesus. And so I think there's a call for us here too, to discern God in creation and work with God. We've been given the task to care for creation, not dominating or controlling or subduing, but to be caretakers. So can we see God at work in nature and creation today? Of course, we're all aware of the dangers of climate change. We see unseasonably warm, cold weather around the earth. Many natural disasters are occurring, pandemics, the extinction of species, including the threat of our own extinction. There's real anxiety around climate change today. So how do we work with God to care for nature, for creation and our environment? What does it look like for this church to get more involved and engaged with God's work in caring for our creation? God invites us to join with God in this. What I also find surprising in this passage is the faith that Jesus places in us. We often rightly talked about the faith that we must have in God. However, I think this passage speaks to us also about the faith God has in us. Again, instead of the focus being only on Jesus in this passage, the attention turns in the second part of the passage to Peter, an ordinary human being with all of his bumbling and hot-headedness. Peter was often putting his foot in his mouth, and this time you'd think, he's done it again, boldly asking for something that he shouldn't be asking for. I can remember one stage when the disciples asked to be seated at the right hand of God when Jesus comes to his glory. Awkward moment there. But this time, Jesus responds in the affirmative, not chiding Peter for his boldness, but affirming him, stretching out his hands for Peter to take and calling him to do what Jesus was doing, to participate with him. And so Peter miraculously begins to walk on the water. So have you ever considered that God has faith in us? God calls us to discern the work that God is doing and has faith that we will do the work. So what is the work that God has called us to do in this church, in our neighbourhoods as well, and in our world? So there's an invitation here, not so much to work for God, but to work with God, to participate in the work of God, of reconciliation and restoration in a messed up world that still contains so much beauty. We are called to speak and embody the good news of the gospel in a world that needs to recover wonder, enchantment, and hope. Many in our neighbourhoods and world are longing for something more in a world that seems a little bit flat. A while ago, I read a book called Enchantment by Catherine May, who doesn't identify as a Christian. The book has been very popular, and she writes about her struggle to find something deeper in life. So I want to read a quote from this book. It's a little bit long, but I want to read it in full because I think she beautifully captures the longing that many people in our world feel today. She writes, "This life I have made is too small. It doesn't allow enough ideas, enough beliefs, enough encounters with the exuberant magic of existence. I've been so keen to deny it, to veer deliberately towards the rational, to cling solely to the experiences that are directly observable by others. Only now, when everything is taken away, can I see what a folly this is. I don't want that life anymore. I want what the ancients had, to be able to talk to God. Not in a personal sense to a distant figure who is unfathomably wise, but to have a direct encounter with the flow of things, a communication without words. I want to let something break in me, some dam that has been shoring up this shamefully atavistic sense of the magic behind all things, the tingle of intelligence that was always waiting for me when I came to tap in. I want to feel that raw, elemental awe that my ancestors felt, rather than my tame, explained modern version. I want to prise open the confines of my skull and let in a flood of light and air and mystery. I want to retain what the quiet reveals, the small voices whose whispers can be heard only when everything falls silent. Can you hear the longing there for something more? God has faith in us to re-enchant this world. What we must do with this faith God has in us is have courage. Unlike Peter looking to the wind and the waves, we look to the one who calls us in faith to participate with God in the work of restoring our world. And that's not an easy thing to do because we live in an age of anxiety. As I mentioned before, there's anxiety about the state of the planet. There's now an official term, climate anxiety. There are climate psychologists to help us work through that anxiety. In our faith community in Surrey Hills, we're holding a workshop on climate anxiety, led by a climate psychologist in October in the Surrey Hills Neighbourhood Centre, which you're all welcome to come to. This academic, Sally Gillespie, has written a book on the topic. We have so many people in our community talking to us about their anxiety bordering on despair. And we're doing this because there's a need in our neighbourhood for safe places where people can talk about this. How do we maintain courage and hope without focusing on the troubles of the time and letting them overwhelm us like the wind and the waves in the ocean? There are other anxieties, of course, in our world. We could name many. Sometimes there are the anxieties of the church. We hear about the decline of the church. We talk about the death of the church. We worry about what the future of the church looks like. And often this moves us with that anxiety to try and control the situation by talking about numbers and growth and plans and strategies to fix the problem. We act sometimes as though we are not a people of death and resurrection. Again, this is a situation where we need to hear that God has faith in us and God calls us to participate with God in the work that we discern God is up to in our neighbourhoods and in our world. Sometimes we forget it's God's church and that God invites us to work with God in God's church. So we are asked to be courageous at this time, even in the midst of decline and death. We are asked to be as courageous as Peter walking out of that boat onto the water. And this is a risky work, a surprising work, a work of enchantment. It is time for us to think about the new things that God is calling us to dream up and not to be dream squashers like Joseph's brothers. What is God calling Pitt Street Uniting to engage in our neighbourhoods, in our world? What new things is God up to in a world that desperately needs good news? And I think the very encouraging thing is we are not left alone. When we fail, and we will, because we're human, there's no judgment or berating from God. Instead, like Jesus, God stretches out his hand like a supportive friend, telling us not to doubt, but to have faith. Not to look to the winds and the waves, but to look to God. And I love that compassion of God. We are not abandoned, but instead held in the grip of God's hand as we participate with God on that mission. So we are given permission to ask, to try, to fail, to get back up again, to try again, to participate with God in this new work that we are called to do if we have eyes to see it. Missiologist Alan Roxburgh calls it the great unravelling. The new things that God is doing in the church will create an unravelling and a decluttering. Do we have eyes to see what the Spirit is doing? And none of this is quick or even achievable in our lifetime. Thank God that we are called to have a bigger perspective. I'm reminded of this encouragement attributed to the priest Oscar Romero. It's called A Future Not Our Own. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives include everything. This is what we are about. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water the seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing this. This enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and to do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own. I want to end with this encouragement by theologian Kate Tristram. Our Bible sets before us the idea that God may use a minority to serve the majority. Church history says the same. It's because of the faithfulness of the few, not the many, that the Christian faith has come down the ages to us. And we have the chance to know God in this way. It has always been so. If God has called us and we want to respond, then we must be faithful to our own vision, whatever the many think. But we must do it with open hearts and open arms, not safeguarding our fewness or specialness. And we must do this in healthy laughter directed at ourselves. Because really, it is so ridiculous to think that God has chosen us for anything, even though it is very true. Amen.